I'll drink that tea. Yeah. All right. Did you guys get some good lunch? You guys, I'm from Texas. We say you guys. You guys get some good lunch? All right. Excellent. All y'all. That's the plural of y'all. All y'all. So we're going to be talking about language, so this is all important, okay? So we're going to have a little discussion on linguistics. Don't be mean to me now. All right. So any of the questions that are hard, I'm going to make Dan come up and answer. So just so y'all know, okay? All right. So what we want to talk about, so we've talked about, so one of the things that I always tell people is the flood and the tower are two of the things that explain our world better than anything else. And in fact, I did a conference in Austin called The Tower and the Flood. And because the flood actually explains the geological formations we see around us, and the Tower of Babel explains the people groups that we see around us. Because when we were young, a lot of us were taught that there were different races. That's not true. Science is now caught up to the Bible. The Bible's been telling people there's not multiple races for years and years and years and years and years. And science has now finally caught up and said, oh yeah, really there's no real genetic difference between the races, okay? It's just visual. And so the Tower of Babel actually explains the people groups that we see much better than evolution, because evolution actually brought about death and destruction, and like people were chained up, they were, slaves, they were all kinds of stuff because of evolution, because people could say they're not as evolved as us. Okay? That was the whole thing of Darwin's book, The Favored Races. Most people don't know that. That's the subtitle, and the favored races. So we'll keep going. Before I get ahead of myself and start talking about stuff I shouldn't be talking about yet, we're going to be talking about the Tower of Babel, because the Tower of Babel actually makes things make sense. This picture I have here is just sort of a stylized picture of the Tower of Babel. We believe that we can find through historical data and actually checking out architecture throughout the area that the Tower of Babel probably would have been what's called a ziggurat. It would have been a stepped pyramid, and I'll show you that here in a little bit. But I always like to say this because otherwise somebody will go, well, why do you have a picture of a round tower if you think it's just a stylized picture? So, but it's a lot of fun. So I'm going to try and read this verse really quick because I thought it'd be cool to have it scroll up, and then I realized I don't read that fast. So hopefully I get through it. I tried it right before I came here, and I was like, oh, this could go bad. So if not, we'll all pull out our Bibles, and we'll continue to read it, okay? So we talk about the Tower of Babel. It says here, now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if it was one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they planned. No! It was a test. It was a test. Here's what we're going to do. We'll start from the middle. This is the magic of PowerPoint here. Here we go. Now we'll play. Oh, it's still moving. All right, we'll do this. Well, I'll just read it for you. It says, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So, when we talk about the Tower of Babel, we'll go ahead and start it now again. Don't mind the scrolling language there. So when we talk about the Tower of Babel, we're really talking about not so much that people were evolved differently. We're talking about how the people came out the ark. They were one people. And they came to believe that they could build a tower to the heavens. Now, I sometimes say they build a tower to God. Well, that's not technically what they say. They say they want to build a tower to heaven. Does anybody know why they said that?
Survive the flood.
Survive the flood? No.
Yeah, where they wanted to survive with God, didn't they? They wanted to show, their own power and strength and power. They were just as good as God.
Yeah, they wanted to show their own power. She gets the prize. There's no prize, but you would get it if there was one. So. But yeah, that's absolutely correct. They wanted to show that they were a great nation. They didn't want to be scattered all over the world, right? There's some, as parents, I don't have any kids, but as parents, we want our kids to be close to us a lot of times. Well, some of you, maybe your children are like, Dallas is looking good. But no, usually you want your family close to you, and you want to be all together. And the same thing is happening here. They're saying, hey, if we keep going out, we're all going to be these little bitty tribes that nobody knows about. We're going to have to try and scrimp and save and survive. Why don't we just stick together and make a name for ourselves? And that's what they're looking to do. And so that's why we look at the view from the tower. And we're going to look at a few different things. The view of man's history, the view of the dispersion, the view of the languages, and the view of the cultures. And we'll start out with the view of man's history. When you look at the view of man's history, there's, of course, two different histories that we can look at. Of course, there's Darwinian evolution, and then there they are, Darwinian evolution, and there is six-day creation, or biblical creation, what I would call it. Now, Darwin actually did write a book, but if you were to look at evolution and kind of write a book, you would basically say it's a single cell to a scientist. It's the ascent of man, right? We go from a single cell upward, evolving upward, to a scientist, like this really smart scientist. It's the ascent of man. But who wrote that? That's right. It's man's opinion. That's who wrote that. Because they're just looking around thinking that, hey, we must have come from this little bitty cell. Yeah, exactly. And so now if you look at the Bible, though, it's a totally different story. The Bible actually would read more like, from perfection to mutated mess, the descent of man. So remember, I said it's not that there's no mutations. We know that there's mutations. As a matter of fact, we gather mutations there's an average of about 100 per generation. And we'll talk about that here in a second. So we started out perfect with Adam and Eve, and it's been going downhill ever since. Okay? So that's the story that the Bible tells us. But who wrote that? That was the creator of the universe, right? So God knew. God was there. He's the one who knows. I mentioned that we do know that we actually retain genetic mutations. There's something called genetic entropy. We actually, through each generation, will pass on about 100 mutations. Now, most of them are non-deleterious. They're not harmful. They're things that you wouldn't even notice. But the problem is that they build generation upon generation. So you've got grandpa giving his son 100 mutations, and then he's giving his son 100 mutations plus grandpa. So now the grandson's getting 200. Now, how many generations can you get before you start to get problems? See, there was a conventional scientist, not even a creationist, who started studying genetic entropy and realized you can't get very far into the generations before you have a real mess on your hands. He actually writes, why aren't we dead 100 times over? If we've been around millions and billions of years, why aren't we dead 100 times over? And of course, humans would be even 200,000 years, depending on who you're asking and the latest find, right? Up to 300,000 years was one of the latest finds. But we should be dead over 100 times over with genetic entropy. And so it's a real problem. Evolutionists want you to believe that we evolved from these, hominid creatures, these hominid creatures, okay? And so we evolved out of them. So we have this primate ancestor that kind of split off, and we, the humans, went off over this way. This is what they say about humans. They say, anthropologists have discovered evidence for the practice of hunter-gatherer culture by modern humans, Homo sapiens, and their distant ancestors dating as far back as 2 million years. Before the emergence of hunter-gatherer cultures, earlier groups relied on the practice of scavenging animal remains that predators left behind. So way back when, you were eating roadkill. And it's not like you were cooking it, cutting it up and cooking it. You were just on the side of the road eating roadkill, but there was no roads, right? So that's what they're telling you is, yeah, you actually had to evolve into a hunter-gatherer culture. Before that, this is what you were doing. This is what evolution wants you to believe. Evolutionists want you to believe that you came from Neanderthals. And now that we used to say that we came from Neanderthals, now they say, oh, Neanderthals are pretty much our peers. Like we've interbred with them. We have their DNA. They actually use music instruments. They use tools. They did all this kind of stuff. But you think about it, the Bible tells a different story. It doesn't say that we were picking, carcasses off the side of the road. The Bible tells us there were actual professions in Genesis. In Genesis 4:1-2, it says, now Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So from the very beginning, you had farming and ranching. You weren't picking carcasses, okay? You have professions. You think about it. If you continue on, it says, then Lamech took for himself 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, and the name of the second was Zillah. And Ada bore Jabal. He was the father, and remember, I'm Texas, I don't say anything right. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and lute. And as for Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. So within just a few generations, you have a whole bunch of professions, don't you? You actually have ranchers, farmers, you have metal workers, and you have musicians. That's not the story evolution is telling you, is it? It's not. And yet you realize we keep finding tools and musical instruments with these hominid creatures. See, the Bible actually explains this stuff. If you continue on, if you look at Genesis 10, it says, these are the sons of Shem by their clans and languages, in their territories and nations. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent within their nations. From these the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. In other words, by the time you get to Noah, these aren't just little tribes. These are actual nations. These are huge groups of people that were known to one another. Okay? These weren't little tribes that were picking carcasses. And yet evolution wants you to believe, hey, you came from this hominid. You came from this little ancestor. Now, here's a good question. How do they know this? I mean, when you really think about it, how do they know that you came from these little hominid creatures? I mean, you think about it, this is a great one. You look at that and you're like, wow, they really know exactly what we looked like. You got the hair. I can see a little of Dan in that one. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. It was easy. That was too easy. I apologize. So,
mutation.
The mutation, that's what it is, yeah. But you think about it, that's really cool. I wonder what they found to be able to tell you that that's what it looked like. Well, there was Java man over in Indonesia. So you take a look at this. Here you go. This is what they found. Now, here's the question. Did they find the white parts or the brown parts? They found the brown parts. So what I'm showing you is, this is reality. That's imagination.
Yeah, they obviously did.
Right? And so the point is this. How did they get from that to this? Pure imagination. It has to do with the fact that they want you to believe that you come from this little ape-like hominid creature. And so what they do is they take what they actually find and they go to an artist and say, hey, we want you to create what we think it would look like. And they actually talk to these artists. And a lot of the artists will literally say things like, yeah, I made the eyes this way because I wanted you to feel like it was becoming human and staring into its soul. Or, we wanted to give it some human-like features. It's art. It's imagination. And yet they want to tell you that it's absolutely real. This is actually from the Smithsonian website. They had an old website that showed the family tree, because they used to give you that concept of like, oh, it's all linear. This turned into this, and this turned into this, turned into Neanderthal, this turned into a human, right? Well, then they started realizing, oh, you can't really do that. So they started doing family trees, and they would branch off, Ardipithecus cadava over here, and Lucy over here, and this one over here, and say, well, we don't really know how they all work together. It's just like this family tree. And that's how they got away with it. But take a look at what they actually know. What do they actually know about good old AK, Ardipithecus cadava? It says AK was bipedal, walked upright, probably similar in body and brain size to a modern chimpanzee, and had canines that resemble those in later hominins that still project beyond the tooth row. This early human species is only known in the fossil record by a few postcranial bones and sets of teeth.
But that's the issue.
Did you? Yeah, it is the issue. It says a few postcranial bones and sets of teeth. Now here's the other one. This is the fun one. One bone from the large toe has a broad, robust appearance. It's found this big toe. It says a broad, robust appearance suggesting its use in bipedal push-off. That's how they know it walked, because he had a big toe. I apologize. Yeah, it was robust. Yeah, that's fair. That is fair, yeah. So it's known only by a few postcranial bones. It's only known by a big, broad, robust, hairy-looking toe or whatever. And they say that's why we know it walks, right? But it gets that, well, that's imagination, right? Imagination. But then it goes on. It goes on to this. Watch this. It says, below are some of the still unanswered questions about AK. Was AK routinely bipedal? Wait a second. You already told me that he was. This is a question now? And so the question is, so far the evidence for AK's upright walking comes from a single toe bone that dates to 5.2 million years old and was found 10 miles away from the other specimens. Is anyone like going, what? It's a single toe bone that they found 10 miles away, and somehow they were like, oh, that's Bob's toe bone right there. That is a robust Bob toe right there, I tell you. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So, now everybody's getting into it. We're gonna call up some evolutionists here pretty soon. Let me tell you something. So, can you actually know which one's a human, which one's an ape? Absolutely yes. The truth of the matter is, what they'll do is when they find a jaw, they find part of a jaw, they create a jaw, and then they'll position that jaw in a different place, in a different way, or they'll move the nose around a little bit. Let me show you what I mean. You can tell what's a human and what's an ape by the eyes. You take a look at the eyes. Apes don't have good peripheral vision. Humans do. You can see the cutout for the eye. And so that's why you can actually see, if you stare straight ahead, you can see almost 180 degrees, right? So the idea is that the eye will tell you whether or not it's a human or an ape. The other thing is the nose. Is anybody wearing glasses here? Yeah. You want to know why you can do that? Because the bridge of your nose. Apes don't have a bridge to their nose, right? And then, of course, the teeth. The mouth on a human is actually more flat. This jaw juts out, and the teeth will overhang. And so how can you make a hominid look a little more human or a little more ape-like? Well, if you didn't find the jaw with that skull, what you could do is push that jaw out a little bit. Let's attach it a little more up here and make that jaw jut out a little bit. And then you can slope this top part here. Or if it's more of an ape and you want to make it look more human, why don't you give it a little nose bridge? See, this is how they're creating these hominid animals, these hominid creatures. They're not, as you saw, they didn't find all those bones. They're making it up. And yet they can convince you of this evolution because of the way they're putting those bones together, the way they're putting those human skulls together. This is the stuff that they find. They didn't find the nose. They didn't find the cut here. They didn't find the entire jaw to know how far out it went. And yet they're making it up. And so this is the kind of stuff that they find, that they piece together, and then they suddenly, ta-da, they make it into evolution.
Is it constantly changing?
It is constantly changing, yeah. Absolutely. So it's constantly changing, but that's the view of man's history. Evolutionists want you to believe that you evolved over millions of years. And yet when you actually look at this observable evidence, it shows that we didn't. It shows that we've been around just about 6,000 to 10,000 years. Let's take a look at the view of the dispersion. You can actually look, when we talk about the actual people groups being dispersed out from the Tower of Babel, we can look at two different things. We can look at architecture and we can look at relatives. So in other words, we can track some of that movement based on Noah's grandsons. I'll show you what I mean. If we take a look at architecture, you can tell a lot by architecture. So Indonesia has some interesting architecture. They have Dutch architecture, Dutch colonial architecture. Well, why is that? Anybody know? They were colonized by the Dutch, right? And so the Dutch colonists come along and they build their kinds of houses there. And so now you have a whole bunch of Dutch colonial architecture in Indonesia. But they also have it in all of these places, in Africa, in Brazil, in the United States. Do you realize that the English fought a war with the Dutch and took part of New York, part of this area up here? They were in Canada. You find this architecture all over the place because that's where they were. And so you can trace them based off that architecture. Well, you can do the same thing. They believe that the Tower of Babel would have been a ziggurat based off the architecture that they find, the way it's described, and then where they find it in that area. This is actually in Mexico. This is Egypt. This is Iraq. This is in Bolivia. This is in Iran. This is in Iran. And then this one is actually over in Africa, if I remember correctly. So the problem is that you see it spread all over the place. Okay? And again, I don't have any special books. You can go to the internet and find this stuff. You can look up ziggurat, and you can find all the different ziggurats. They find them over in Indonesia, in the Philippines. They find them everywhere. Okay? And so these ziggurats were spread out, just like the Dutch would take their architecture and place it wherever they were. These people would take their architecture and put it wherever they are as well. Otherwise, how did they all build that same structure? They had to have learned it from somewhere. And so you see that dispersion. But you can kind of go, okay, cool, that's kind of nice. But here's something else you can do. You can also look at the relatives. You can look at Noah's grandsons. Let me do this real quick. I want to change this. Sorry, I'm going to add one thing here. There we go. So we take a look at, a lot of people say, well, where is the Tower of Babel? Do we really know where the Tower of Babel is? We've never truly found absolute evidence of where the Tower of Babel is. We believe it's somewhere in this area. There's three different areas that they believe they found a ziggurat that would make the most sense. Now, I believe that there is one called Eridu. So this is Eridu. This is just a map. So there's a huge ziggurat that's been destroyed and built on top of. And Eridu is a little bit different because everybody said, well, it says that it was built in Babylon. Well, there was Nebuchadnezzar who built Babylon. He rebuilt Babylon. He actually says that he believed that he was rebuilding the Tower of Babel. So a lot of people believe that that's where it is. But he actually says that, but it doesn't actually fit all the evidence that we find. There was actually a second site of Babylon, though. If you go back and read, there was actually 2 Babylons in history. And this was the first one. It's the oldest ziggurat that they've ever found. And, of course, it's destroyed, and they've had to rebuild on it. But it's the oldest one they found. Is that the Tower of Babel? I couldn't tell you that it is, but it is probably one of the best guesses that we have. If we talk about the relatives, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. If we talk about the relatives, Noah's grandsons, when we look at the Bible, it says, now this is the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the sons were born to them after the flood. So all 3 of these sons had a whole bunch of kids, and they had kids, and they had kids, and they had kids, right? So if we actually track where they went, we can kind of see the dispersion. So if we take a look at Japheth, he had all these kids, right? We can take a look at just 3. If we look at Gomer is actually Turkey. So it was originally Galatia. Josephus actually talks about that Galatians were called Gomerites. So historically, we see where they were Gomerites. They would be the descendants of Gomer. And if you look at Havan, that's the Hebrew word for Greece. So in Daniel 8:21, it says the king of Grecia, which is that word, Havan. And then you have Medes, which is the Medes. So you have the Persians and the Medes. The Medes are always with the Persians, and we'll see the Persians here in just a minute. So they go to Iran. They actually went to Iran, and you can see them there. And then here's an interesting one, Germany. Ashkenaz is the Hebrew word for Germany, which is kind of interesting. So you start to see these people groups coming out like that. And that's just one of the sons. So let's take a look at Ham. Ham had 4 kids. We'll just take a look at 3. If you look at Cush, down here in Ethiopia, Cush is the Hebrew word for Ethiopia. It is always translated that way in the Bible. Okay, same thing for Mizraim. Is the Hebrew word for Egypt. It's always translated in the Bible that way. And then Phut, this is a Hebrew word for Libya. So Josephus actually writes that Phut also was the founder of Libya and called the inhabitants Phutites from himself. Okay, and so by Daniel 11, they actually start calling it Libya. And so you watch this same dispersion with the grandsons. Let's go to Shem. Shem has all these children. If you take a look at the kids, you can find, we'll just do 3 of them. Elam is Persia. Remember I said there's Medai, so it's the Medes and the Persians. So Elam is the Persians. The Medes and the Elamites. So they're referenced as the Elamites at one point. They are the Persians. And then Asher is the Hebrew word for Assyria. It's always translated in the Bible that way. And then Aram is the Hebrew word for Syria, not Assyria, but Syria. And they are called the Arameans, and they have the language Aramaic. Okay? And so as you track all these grandsons of Noah, you start to see the way people dispersed out. And then all the way into other countries, and some of them had ships. It talks about, if you read the Bible, it talks about one of the nations was makers of ships, and they loved sailing out. They're the ones that actually went and dispersed out across the oceans, they say. So that's the view of the dispersion. What about the languages, though? I mean, we still have 2 really key factors if you want to talk about, the Tower of Babel explaining the people groups. There's 2 major things. Number 1 is language, and number 2 is how people look, okay? And so let's talk about that. The view of the languages. Anybody have any idea of how many languages there are? How many? 4,000. Anybody else? What? 12? No? Oh, 12,000? No. Wow, you went all in. You just went like both feet first, man. Golly. That was good. It's not right, though. Anybody else? So, what? 200. So, according to Ethnologue, there's 7,151. Ethnologue is a site that actually tracks languages. They track language families and everything. So 7,151, that's actually up from the last time, about 2019, I checked on this. So it's actually up by about 5 or 6 languages. But here's the thing. That's a lot of languages. Did all those languages evolve? Not exactly, because you have language families. So language families are groups of languages that are related to each other because they come from a common older language or because of their roots. We talked about Indonesia and the Dutch colonies. Well, Indonesia had multiple tribes. They didn't have an actual language. They had all their different tribes had different languages. And so when the Indonesians wanted their independence from the Dutch and from the Japanese, both, they created their own language called Bahasa, which technically just means language in Bahasa. And but some of the words they have are very close to some of the words like in Spanish and things like that, and because the words are from an older original language. And so you see that. So, of course, when we're talking about language, the Scots make up their own language. I'm just saying, in Texas, we have weird sayings, but we don't make up words the way some of y'all Scots people do. I'm just saying, those pictures actually from my first trip here. Now, I know not all of you guys say this stuff, so don't get me wrong when I say this. How many of you say blether? That's a good number, okay? I was thinking about whether I should put blether in there, and then Dan actually used the word like 2 days ago. I was like, I guess that's going in, okay. So in America, we would say, we're going to have a chat. We're just going to chat. We're going to talk, But you're blether. Would you like to come and have a blether? It sounds like something you would get at Starbucks, like a scone or something. But, And then there's like Monty and Mickle, Max and Muckle. Does anybody know what that means? I've asked several people. Nobody knows what it means. So that one, basically, we come up with all kinds of stuff in Texas too, but I'll leave that one alone. Your cats are deed. Does anybody know what that means? Do what? Your trousers are too short. Do you actually say that? Oh, okay. So, I'm just curious. So we come up with all kinds of stuff in Texas too. I mean, when we say, like, I read one called, I'm going to scran me we pan in. It means like, I'm going to eat, I'm going to stuff my face, right? There was one in a book that I found. Like, none of y'all use that, right? In Texas, we say we're going to chow down. We're going to chow down, or we're going to get our grub on. I don't know why we say that, but chow down. Maybe so. That could be. What about if I say I'm going to get after somebody? I say, I'm going to be on you like a pack of dogs on a 3-legged cat. But it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? We didn't make up words. That's all I'm saying. Just saying. You got on high waters. See, that's your cats are deed. We're just talking about how you could walk into high water because your pants are so high or your trousers are so high. Hopefully your pants are too. But your trousers are so high, you could walk into water. You wouldn't have to worry about it. So you got on high water. We all make up our own languages. But that's the thing is that we have to ask, how many language families are there? Anybody have to take a wild guess? Don't say a low number for heaven's sakes. Give me something. All right. How many language families? Everybody's being nice now. 2,000? Okay.
No, 300.
300? Okay, I better stop right there. All right. So Ethnologue also tracks the language families. They're still working on Africa. Africa is a real problem for them because there's so many different languages, and they're trying to find where those actually come together. And so the number keeps dwindling. It's gone down since 2019 as well. So the max number that they can find is going to be 142 language families. So from over 7,000 down to 142. That's a huge difference. Do you kind of see, like, wait a second, that's getting pretty close to the Bible. That's getting pretty close because you think about it. If you look at the Bible, it says, so let's talk about languages for a second. I'll get to that in just a second. If you look at language, because you can kind of go, okay, fine, 147, maybe we evolved that. Maybe, one of the common things is, we were just making sounds, and then we all started to understand what that sound meant. But the problem is we've tried that. animals, with primates. We tried all this kind of stuff. We've tested these theories. It never works. There is no creature that has the same kind of language ability that a human has. It is absolutely unique, and it's absolutely incredible. So there's just a couple of things. The mystery of language evolution, they wrote this. They conclude, based on the current state of evidence, we submit that the most fundamental questions about the origins and evolution of our linguistic capacity remain as mysterious as ever, with considerable uncertainty about the discovery of either relevant or conclusive evidence that can adjudicate among the many open hypotheses. In other words, there's not a shortage of theories. It's just that nobody can actually find real evidence for it. Here's this one. It says, the problems of the evolution of language and of the cognitive capacities that support it extend over a wide range of disciplines, from comparative ethology to neuroscience, psychology, and linguistics, but loom particularly large in evolutionary biology, where the emergence of language has been described as one of the few major evolutionary transitions. What made this transition possible? Answering this question is like finding a missing piece of a puzzle from which many other pieces are also missing, and over which there is no consensus as to how the big picture should look. The shape of the sought-after piece can still be pondered, but to do so meaningfully requires that assumptions be made about the other missing pieces and how they might fit together. That's a real problem. Real quick, just lastly. It says, our ability to form a limitless number of thoughts into spoken word is one of the things that separates us from our less evolved cousins. While we know that language first appeared among Homo sapiens somewhere between 30,000 to 100,000 years ago, the secret to how language evolved is still unknown. Now, obviously, I'm quoting evolutionists, right? So this is their own words, that no one can figure out how evolution evolved. So, did we win the evolutionary language lottery? Because you think about it, nobody can figure out how it happened. No one can understand how it evolved. But you didn't. If you did this, you would win the evolutionary lottery. But you wouldn't just win it one time. You wouldn't win it 2 times. You'd have to win it 147 times in different parts of the world. Do you really think that that's what happened? 147 times we won the evolutionary lottery. And yet the Bible in Genesis 10:32 says, these were the families of the sons of Noah according to their generations in their nations, and from these nations were divided on the earth after the flood. And that goes into the table of nations in chapter 10, right? The table of nations goes in and separates out the different family groups. And so when they actually look at that, they said there's differing numbers, but the minimum number that they can come up with is 78. So from the table of nations, there would be a minimum of 78. Ethnologue right now, as it stands, is at 142 and dwindling, going lower. We're starting to come in a little bit. You can see that, right? And so you've got a minimum of 78, a maximum of 142. Now, do you really think that we won the evolutionary language lottery? Or do you think that the Bible has it right and that God separated people out there at the Tower of Babel? So that's the languages, the view of the languages. What about the view of the cultures? This is probably one of the most important ones because this has caused more divisiveness, more wars, more murder and death than any other one. And it's just the physical traits. And so when we talk about the view of the cultures, we can talk about a couple of different things. We can talk about technology and we can talk about appearance, because one of the things that drives this concept of, well, some people aren't as evolved as others, is technology. Think of it this way, though. There's a huge gap between some of the technology between, say, the third world countries and the first world countries, right? But is that really some kind of evolution, or is there a different answer? I would say that there's a very simple answer, to tell the truth. Of course, Charles Darwin, he wrote this, in The Origin of Species, that it's the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Is that what it is? Is that the answer? I don't think it is. I think there's something much simpler than that. When we talk about it, we'll say this. We'll play a little game. You've probably all played it. Whose team will you be on? I'm talking about the zombie apocalypse, right? Everybody's watched the zombie movie, and so surely you've thought, whose team would I be on if I'm stuck in the zombie apocalypse? Who do I want to partner up with to be able to survive? Some of you are like, no, and you're a sinner for thinking that. Like, okay, that's fine. That's fine. I'm just saying, you think about a zombie apocalypse, you got to figure out whose team you're going to be on. Because remember, depending on what family you're in, depending on what friends you have, you're going to have different professions represented. Whether there's a chef, a doctor, an electrical engineer, computer, like an electronics person, a baker. You're going to have all kinds of professions. Now, if my family was isolated out, we would be in trouble. Because we don't have any electrical engineers, we don't have any doctors, we don't have any contractors. We pretty much are going to be eating berries and trying to cook lizards, okay? And our technology level would be down here. There'd be no MacBook Pro. There would be like makeshift abacuses and stuff, like where you tie knots to count and stuff. Like that's just where my family is, technology and intelligence-wise. I'm just saying. And so you got to figure out whose team you're on. At my old church in Austin, I always said that I would be on Team Steve because Steve is this guy. He's about 70 years old, and he's like an old cowboy. And he's one of those old cowboys that like never die. Like he's 70, and like you could hit him with a 2x4, and he would just like, oh, that tickled, you know? Like I don't even know what he's made of. And so, but I would always be on Team Steve because Steve is constantly sending me pictures. Like, well, I had some bubble gum and some PVC pipe, and I made a computer. How? No, you can't do that, Steve. He's constantly sending us pictures of this stuff and going, do y'all know what this is? No, Steve, I don't know what it is. Well, we didn't have the right wiring, so I had to grab this, and I found an acorn and this over here, and we created a filter and a pump for a sewage system. Okay, all right, that's fine. I don't care as long as I'm on Team Steve during the zombie apocalypse. That's the important thing. So there are different, the whole point of that is just to say that there are different levels of technology, different levels of skill sets, and depending on what your family had, your nation had, is where you're going to be. If you're separated out and you can't talk to anyone else, remember, right now we're all speaking English. Y'all barely speak English, but y'all are speaking English, okay? You imagine if you've just been dispersed off to an island over here and you can't speak anybody else's language. You can't learn technology. You can't learn how to do things. You're on your own. And so that technology is going to depend on a few different things. So we'll do that in just a second. So why the differences? So number one, you're isolated families, you have isolated skills, right? So if you go all the way back, remember I told you that there was professions, remember? So there was ranchers, farmers, metal workers, and musicians. If you're a family, a nation of musicians, you're in trouble, okay? You're like, it's going to sound good, but it's going to look bad, okay? Sorry, guys, I didn't mean that, but anyway. So isolated families equals isolated skills. Then location, 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 right? That's the real estate motto. If you land in America where there is a huge amount of resources, our land is almost more resource rich. In the United States, we're almost more resource rich than any other country. Indonesia is a very resource rich country. There's a lot of countries that have a lot of resources, but if you're not in one of those countries and you don't have the metal, the ore, the wood, and all this kind of stuff, what are you going to do? You've got to learn how to trade, right? But if you can't speak their language, especially in the beginning, you're going to be stuck like Chuck, right? Oh, that's another saying that we say in Texas, to be stuck like Chuck. Poor Chuck, he's always stuck. So it depends on the location that you're at as to what your technology level is going to be. And then lastly, culture, tradition, and religion. Because you think about it, depending on your culture, tradition, and religion, it will depend on how you work with other people. There was a missionary several years back that just was determined to go out to this island. I think it was in India, and there was like this island, and this tribe didn't want anything for the outside world. They killed anybody that went over there, and this guy was determined to go tell them about God. And so he convinced somebody to fly him over there, and they killed him. With bows and arrows, they killed him. Because they believed that anybody from the outside was evil, and they could not have contact with them. You want to know why their technology wasn't any good? Because they didn't have the technology and they didn't want to work with anybody that did. So there's lots of reasons why our technology differences are the way they are. So what about appearances? We'll finish up with this. When we talk about appearances, number one, first and foremost, there are no races. Okay? A lot of us know that today. When we were younger, though, we were taught that there were races and that those races evolved at different rates. Here's a couple of quotes, though. Science is catching up with the Bible. It says, but the genes that explain the phenotypic differences, characteristics like hair color, etc., between populations only represent a tiny part of our genome, confirming once again that the concept of race from a genetic standpoint has been abolished. That's from the National Center for Scientific Research. Here's another one. It says, here is the biological problem with race. The genetic variation within each of the various ethnic groups of Homo sapiens is greater than that between the various ethnic groups. In other words, what he's saying is, if you have a white Scottish guy and an Asian guy here, the differences within the Scottish group and the differences within the Asian group are greater than between the two groups. You can actually see a greater variation. And so that's the problem with coming up with some kind of concept of race, is that you just can't bear it out scientifically. There's no scientific evidence of it. I mean, think of it this way. Am I white? Everybody always gets nervous when I ask this. Who said translucent? Who said that? Am I white? No. I actually checked. I'm peach paradise. Okay, no, that's not true. That's not true. But I'm not white, right? And if you were to say that somebody was black, if you put them up against an actual black screen, guess what? They're not black. Even the darkest person you'd find isn't actually black. And so here's the kicker. There's a couple of different genes. Now, don't get me wrong. This isn't the only one. But melanin is one of the main things that actually gives us skin color. It's just a matter of how much you have. That's it. Some of us have more melanin in our skin than others. That's it. Now, there's a couple of other genes that actually will regulate a little bit more of a red tinge or a yellow tinge as well. But for the most part, melanin, we are all the same color. It's how dark you are of that color melanin. So there's no race. It's just a matter of how much melanin you have in your skin. And that's the crazy part. We used to think that for so long. You think about it, that works with our skin color. It works with our eye color. It works with our hair color. Now, there are some mutations that can cause different colors and stuff like that. Blue eyes are mutations, and red hair is mutation, which means some of y'all are mutants, okay? Just saying. But it's all has to do with the color, the melanin color, okay? And so we don't have to worry about this. There are no races. We don't have to worry about it at all. And the truth is that when you look at evolution has told us that people have evolved over millions of years. And it has caused a huge amount of harm in our culture. But if we were to actually believe the Bible tells us we are one race, we are one blood. The Bible tells us that there's saved and unsaved. Those are the only two options. That's the only differences there are. And the truth of the matter is we can say saved and unsaved, and that means there's saved sinners and there's unsaved sinners. And that's the problem, is that everybody thinks, oh, well, all you saved people think you're better than us. No, we're sinners saved by grace. We're just the ones that went to the foot of the cross and said, please forgive me. That's it. We're all the same. And I hope that everybody sees that. So if you take a look, the biblical account is true. You can track it through genetic entropy. You can track it through the architecture. You can track it through Noah's grandsons. And you can look at all the different appearance differences and actually go back to the genetics and see that we're all the same race. There are no races. You can go back to the language and see that if you go to the table of nations, we're actually coming closer and closer and closer to the table of nations. Can you imagine a day where we actually match up? And then what our evolution is going to say? You made that number up, I'm sure. So that would be a real awesome thing, though. That would be very cool. Let's pray. Father, we just come before you and we thank you that we can come together as one family, as one race, celebrating our diversity, celebrating our differences, enjoying one another's company. But Lord, no matter the differences, we worship you. We come to you and ask that you would speak to our hearts, no matter where we're at, saved, unsaved, in a good place, in a bad place. Father, your Holy Spirit knows everything and can come speak to our hearts. And so we pray that your Holy Spirit would work today in us. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Dave. So we're going to take another 15-minute break, and then we're going to come back, and we're going to have one shorter kind of session, and then our Q&A right into it. So the questions, if you want to put them back in that little box, that little basket. Sure, you can put that, yes. And then, yep. So